Last time on the Active Self-Protection podcast.
And he went into the bathroom of the main floor of that mental health facility and went into a bathroom stall and with his bag and prepared his weapon in there. He had his first two targets, the psychologist and psychiatrist, which were the first two people that he shot. And then after that, he just pretty much shot at anybody that moved. There was different reports came over the radio that shots had been fired and that people were down. As I rode through the crowd, I said, "Where is he?" And they collectively pointed behind themselves as they fled and said, "There's a man with a gun. He's over there shooting people."
All right, gang, let's talk about dry fire. Dry fire is an important part of anyone's training regimen. We recommend you pick up the Manus Firearms Training System. The Manus X is a phenomenal little tool in your toolbox. Manus has been a longtime supporter of Active Self-Protection, and we are super grateful for their support and their product. We found it to be so valuable in our own shooting work. You're going to get immediate, measurable visual feedback. They can take so much time out of the learning curve of dry fire, and this product is worth every penny, in our opinion. What gets measured gets improved, and this helps you measure every aspect of dry and live fire. Visit them at mantis.com and let them know you heard about them on the Active Self-Protection podcast.
I jumped off the bike and drew my Beretta as I took up a kneeling position and yelled at the individual. I identified myself and yelled at him to police drop the weapon. And he continued to walk towards me and fired off another round. I could see people behind him in the street and hiding behind vehicles. I didn't feel comfortable shooting at him right at that moment because there were so many people in the field of fire behind him. But after I yelled at him the second time, he pointed the rifle in my direction and began to fire. So I fired off 4 rounds in controlled succession. As soon as I could acquire and reacquire the sight picture, I was squeezing the trigger. There were people hiding in cars, hiding underneath cars, that said that my first round looked like it struck him in the shoulder, but it didn't change his behavior. So that's why I continued firing. And on the 4th round, he jumped up in the air, spun around, and landed flat on his back. I remember thinking that I was having a hard time finding him behind my front sight before he dropped. And it didn't occur to me that he was so far away that I couldn't see him behind the front sight. He seemed within range. I figured if I could see him, I could hit him, because I had practiced a lot of precision shots. I would go out into the woods and I would shoot at pop cans and pine cones at fairly long distances. So I was pretty competent in my marksmanship, but it turned out that he was between 68 and 71 yards away when the final shot dropped him, based on the location of my brass and where his body fell.
Let's talk about that for 1 second. This is so important. I just want to point this out. So we John, my boss, and I, we break down badge cam and dash cam videos, and we talk about, what the officer or deputy did right or wrong and kind of try to get a lesson out of those critical incidents. That a 60+ yard shot with a pistol is not easy. It's not easy after you've been pedaling to get somewhere quickly. It's not easy when your adrenaline is almost certainly pumping. Your heart's going a mile a minute, and you are 60. I'm sorry, did you say yards or feet?
Yards.
Yeah, 60 yards away. That's a really, really tough shot on someone, by the way, who's also shooting back or potentially shooting back at you. So that is not a gimme. And it's so important what you said about being confident in your marksmanship. If you are a self-defender, if you are a law enforcement officer, whatever, and a gun is something that you regularly carry and use, that confidence in your abilities to do things with that weapon is critically important. Because if you're not confident, if you haven't done the work and put in the time like Andy did, especially going out at his own time and buying a replica gun and dry firing, if you're not confident, either you're not going to take the shot, which isn't good, or you're gonna take a shot that you're probably not going to hit. And with people running around, you can't afford to do that. So what he said about not taking his time, but being deliberate with his shooting and making sure to get a good sight picture, because you'll see on the badge cams frequently an officer will, do some FU shooting after he's been shot at, and he's just mag dumping somebody, with splits that are impossible that he has any kind of a sight picture. So I just wanted to make that training point if you hadn't been confident, and I'm also going to say probably had a conversation with yourself before this happened as to whether or not you are really willing to employ deadly force if necessary. Is that something you thought, given some thought to prior to this incident? I'm almost certain it is.
Yes, yeah, I had made up the mind that I could and would use lethal force, and if I encountered any incident where people were being threatened and I hadn't done all I could do to help save them, that I couldn't live with myself afterwards. So I had committed myself to responding and delivering lethal force. Yeah. So based on the brass, where my pile of brass was, I fired the 4 rounds, and from where he dropped, they said it was between 68 and 71 yards. I don't remember him shooting at me, but witnesses said that they saw him shoulder the weapon and fire deliberately and repeatedly in my direction. But I was so focused on the sights and squeezing the trigger that I didn't really see what he was doing as I was shooting at him. But when the final round struck him, it hit him on the bridge of the nose and passed through the corner of his eye into his brain and curved around the curvature of his skull and exited the base of his neck, just leaving a small slit in the skin. But that took the lights out. And the reason that I think he jumped up in the air, which is a Hollywood thing, but it was very shocking and amazing to see, is because he was in mid stride. He was moving and shooting at me, and I think that bullet passing through his brain fired off all of his muscles, where his legs straightened out suddenly and it launched him into the air. But it was a very dramatic leap into the air, and he spun around and landed on his back. And then there was cover on either side of me. There was telephone poles and fire hydrant and a large steel metal like transformer that was on the ground there, that would have been good protection from fire. But I didn't think to take cover until after I dropped him and the threat was over. So I saw there was a pickup truck between he and I, which was the last position of cover. So I moved up to that truck, and as I was moving up, I radioed in that he was down. It sounded to me like that I was talking in a controlled and measured tone, but listening to the radio traffic years later, it was like a punctuationless burst of speech, where I radioed, Fairchild, this is police 6, he's down, shots fired, he's down. And once I made it up to that truck, I was covering him and realized I had tunnel vision at that time, and literally shook my head to try to regain my peripheral vision and check my surroundings for any other threats.
Did that work?
And
shaking your head, did it help?
It seemed, yeah, it seemed to.
Okay.
Or just, I may have still had a little bit of tunnel vision, but I was focusing it elsewhere, not just on him.
I think the fact that you recognize you had tunnel vision at all is commendable. So that's good. A lot of people don't. I mean, they're not cognizant of the fact they have it. It's just something that they're experiencing. So good for you for noticing it and doing something about it.
If not actual literal tunnel vision, I knew that I was definitely fixated on him, and there could have been threats around me. So I began scanning my surroundings to see if there's anybody else, but it was all just medical personnel running around. And then backup got there, and I eventually, my supervisor moved up on him, and I remembered or realized I was cognizant enough to decock my pistol before she moved in front of me while I covered her. And she picked his rifle up with her toe and kicked it to the side, and then medical people rushed in and started performing aid. The first medic that arrived to him said that he had a good pulse, but he wasn't breathing. He said his body was dead, but his body didn't know it.
Right.
Then I helped watch the perimeter for a little while, which was kind of a pointless job because every law enforcement vehicle and fire department and ambulance from 100 miles away was responding to the scene, and the
Sure.
roads were just choked. There was nobody was coming in or out for quite a while. Eventually, I felt like I wasn't doing any good there on the perimeter, and was asking around if there was anything else I could do. And I eventually made it up to the emergency room, where I was watching the door as they were moving wounded in and out. And then I helped search and clear the main floor of the hospital, where I saw a lot of signs of trauma, a lot of shell casings and rips in the carpet where bullets skipped off the floor, and a lot of blood on the ground. I remember thinking when I was at that ER door, that I remember thinking that as I rode up or was driven to the emergency room, we drove past a woman who was lying dead in the street. And I remember seeing her when I was right before I took shots at the gunman, and I was seeing her up close. I was really worried that I might have, like one of my rounds might have strayed into her.
Mm.
So I asked a medic that was running in and out of the ER if he knew her condition, and I said, I'm pretty sure my background was clear when I took those shots, but, and then he interrupted me and said, "Don't worry, she was dead before you even got there." So that was a relief to hear that, but it also made me wonder what he had seen that day to be able to speak with such confidence. There's a lot of traumatic things that people witnessed that day.
Yeah, unfortunately familiar, not to the degree that you are, but I have, I was in law enforcement in one capacity or another for 30 years. And, I think, from experience, there's kind of a little, maybe you cope with it better than I do. There's a little box in the back of my brain where I put all this stuff. Probably not the healthiest coping mechanism, but all of, all the car crashes and all the abused kids and the people shot and killed, I responded to an active shooter at a gym for underprivileged kids. And so I can relate to everything you just said about being prepared, being trained, being confident, in your abilities, having had that conversation with yourself ahead of time about, can I do this if I need to? And then the physiological effects of the auditory exclusion and the tunnel vision, and then just seeing things that no one should ever have to see. And it doesn't matter how tough, tough and rough a police officer or military member you are, these things stay with you. And I could see it in your voice. It still affects you to this day. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. I'm curious why this was the early or mid 90s. So things have changed since then. But I was surprised when I read the part about you then after post shooting going out and doing other things, because I would have assumed a supervisor would have pulled you to the side and said, "Okay, you sit here, and let everyone else handle what's going on now," because you've just been through a traumatic event, you've been through a critical incident, and your thinking can't be as, maybe I shouldn't say it can't be, but your brain is on overload at this point. So would you, if you can go back and do it again, would you have rather someone sat you down? I know you wanted to get in and help, but would it have been better for you and for everyone else for you to have been sat down, taken to a station, and told to be still and not do anything else?
I don't think so, because I definitely wanted to help more while I was on the scene. I didn't want to just sit on the perimeter and behind a truck. I think it was helpful for me to be able to do more after shooting him, to be able to feel like I was still able to do my job, and it wasn't just shoot the guy and then you're being pulled from the game,
Right.
I don't know that I was affected by it immediately. I think I was still able to think rationally and perform the job and be professional and all that. So I think it was helpful to be able to go in and search and clear and find people that were hiding and tell them it was safe.
Yeah, and
So I think I would do that again.
if folks, if you read the book, this, like I said, is an exhaustive detail. If you're a detail person, this book is for you. I highly recommend you pick it up or get an audio copy of it. So, as an aside, now, is there more about the day, the event that you want to cover that you feel like we didn't cover before we talk about like the investigation and then the stuff that followed? I don't want to miss anything.
Some interesting things. Well, one, when I stopped him, he had 19 rounds left in the drum magazine. Also, after I radioed in that I had shot him and he was down, they asked for my location, and I said I was out in front of the ER, when actually 300 yards down the road was a sign that said ER entrance. And that was just the first thing I saw when they asked me for my location. I was just kind of amped up and just said the first thing that I saw. Also, that auditory exclusion. I remember I fired off 4 rounds out of a 9mm Beretta with no hearing protection and had no apparent hearing loss. My ears weren't ringing afterwards, which was pretty incredible. I didn't think about that until afterward, but it's interesting how your mind reacts to stress.
Anyone who's been to a shooting range and didn't get their ears on in time will know how loud that is. And I've heard gunshots in the wild. Fortunately, most of them weren't aimed at me. Some were, but I've been at a place where a shot was from a 40 cal pistol was taken on the other side of a house in a backyard, and it sounds like a cannon going off. If you're not amped up, if you're not expecting it, if if your adrenaline isn't pumping, you don't have auditory exclusion, it is one of the loudest things you'll ever hear. It's up there like with a flashbang. So anything else you wanted to talk about before we talk about the aftermath?
Not that I can think of right now.
Okay. Let's talk about afterwards. Once all the dust is settled, like what does the end of your day look like that day? Like, does anyone pull you aside? Does anyone talk to you? Is there investigators you have to talk to, and walk us through kind of how that worked?
So yeah, when I was inside the hospital searching and clearing, word came down that they were looking for me and wanted me back out on the perimeter. And so I eventually made my way back there and spoke to some sheriff's deputies. The sheriff was taking over the investigation of the shooting, partly I think because it was on county land that the Air Force was leasing. And so I spoke briefly to some investigators there and told them, what I had seen and what I had done, and told them, I pointed over to where I had knelt down and said my brass should be somewhere over there. And they said they'd be interviewing me more thoroughly in a couple of days. They wanted to give me some time to collect my thoughts and to kind of calm down, maybe.
Yeah,
I think
decompress.
some people, I think people remember things as time goes on that they might have not have recalled immediately after the incident. One negative thing that happened right there at that scene was they were relieving me of duty. Right there on the scene, they needed my firearm for evidence, which I understood, but I didn't like being disarmed out in public, especially at the scene of the first shooting I've ever been involved in. I didn't like getting a ride back to our law enforcement squadron unarmed and sitting around in an interview room waiting for the rest of my shift to end, just kind of hanging out. I don't know why they pulled me from the scene so early, but that was kind of a negative feeling. Then a couple of days later, they did interview me, and it felt good to be able to tell this story. And I remember that was the first time I had broke down and started weeping from just all the stress that I was under and things I had seen. I had no remorse for killing the gunman. That's fortunate. I didn't and still don't feel bad for that. I wish he had never been there and caused me to, or done something that made me have to shoot him, but I have no regrets taking his life based on what he was doing at the time.
Mm-hmm.
but I wept for all of the people that were wounded and killed. And back to that there was time distortion. It felt like it took me forever to get to the scene. And I really beat myself up thinking that if I'd have gotten there sooner, I could have saved more lives or could have saved another life. I couldn't see that even though I'd stopped him with 19 rounds in his gun and he was chasing people at the time, I didn't see that I'd saved. I just saw the people who had been seriously wounded and killed. And I dwelled on that and beat myself up. And I figured the only way I could find out how quickly I responded, how long it took me to get there, was to get a copy of the law enforcement and radio, like radio and telephone traffic. They recorded it. So I tried several times to get a copy of that recording so I could see, like the time between the first radio call that came out and then the time where I radioed that he was down. And it took me 14 years to get somebody to finally give me a copy of that tape. They were claiming that they didn't have the technology to make a copy because it was on reel-to-reel dictaphone tape.
Really, the Air Force doesn't have that kind of technology. That's silly on its face.
And I knew that, so I kept appealing it. And finally, somebody went and actually looked in the case file and saw that there was somebody had already made a copy of it. There was a cassette tape there.
Why do you think they were hesitant to release that to you? I don't understand why they would. I mean, it's not like it's some top secret material. Why do you suppose they were so reluctant?
I have no idea. The only thing I can think of is somebody was just being a lazy ass. They probably get a boatload of Freedom of Information Act requests, so they might just automatically deny all of them or as many as they can.
Mr. Brown, how dare you, sir? A lazy person in the federal government? I've never heard of such a thing. That's crazy talk.
You're right. I'm sorry. Yeah, I can't think of any other reason why that other than they were just not wanting to do their job. But finally, after multiple appeals, they transferred that cassette tape to CD and sent it to me. But it was like 14 years after. When I listened to that tape and heard for the first time my 24-year-old voice, it was really hair-raising. But based on the time between the first radio call, which got me pedaling that 0.3 of a mile, and me radioing that shots had been fired and he was down, was less than 2 minutes. So I began to forgive myself after that. That's a pretty quick response time, especially on a bicycle,
I should say.
So I started to realize that I couldn't really have gotten there any sooner. And even if I had, I probably wouldn't have been able to save any more lives. And I'd also started to do other things that allowed me to start processing the shooting. So getting a copy of that tape was helpful. I started to forgive myself, but also it was about that time that I started to process the shooting. Talking about it was helpful, but none of my peers really wanted to talk with me about it. It was as if them hearing me talk about the experience made them feel uncomfortable. And I picked up on that eventually and eventually stopped talking to my friends about it. And whenever I tried to seek counseling, like when I realized that I was having anxiety and such, I would be relieved of duty. Apparently you couldn't be a cop carrying a gun and see a mental health counselor at the same time. So when I found out that I was relieved of duty, I told the counselor I don't need any more counseling, and they told my workplace that I was good to go. So I just eventually learned to stuff those feelings that I was having and not deal with them. But after several years of just stuffing it, it started to eat at me. Pretty much everything I saw, did, heard, or smelled reminded me of something about the shooting. It was like intrusive thoughts. It just couldn't stop thinking about some aspect of the shooting seemed like every minute of the day. And that was causing a lot of anxiety and like hypervigilance. And it seemed the only thing that could calm that anxiety was alcohol. So I began to drink quite a bit off duty. If there was any any social activity, there had to be alcohol involved because any commotion, crowds, or noise made me anxious just because I felt like I had to pay attention to every little sound and movement. And that eventually led to depression and isolation. I would just kind of hole up in my room. I was single at the time, so I would stay in my dorm room and not really go out much unless there was going to be drinking involved. So that, yeah, a couple of times I tried to seek counseling because I knew it was not a healthy way to be dealing with the incident. And each time I got counseling, I was relieved duty. So eventually I got out of the Air Force thinking that I'd be able to find some peace on the civilian side. And eventually I did, but it took quite a while. But I learned, I think all of the wars over in the desert helped the military find new ways to help veterans.
That was my next question. I'm glad you're covering that because, yeah, everything about that story breaks my heart because all that could have been avoided had they known how to deal with you in the first place and get you the help you needed. And tell any cop or anyone in any profession like that, tell a firefighter or an infantry marine that, you know, if you get counseling, you're no longer doing the thing that you love to do, and the natural reaction is going to be, oh no, I'm fine, everything's fine. So, but yeah, please tell me they've evolved since then.
It seemed to have, yes. Unfortunately, it's probably because they had to evolve because so many soldiers and troops are coming home with post-traumatic stress. But yeah, they've learned a lot of better ways to deal with it. Initially, I started out in group therapy with a bunch of Vietnam vets, which I felt out of place there, and not just because they were Vietnam vets, but because they were older people that all they did was complain a lot. I know that now because I'm old and I do a lot of complaining.
Can't confirm. Yes. Can't confirm.
But it wasn't very helpful group therapy wise. But I did some individual counseling with some mental health people and learned to process the feelings and thoughts that I was having about the shooting and how your thoughts pretty much affect your feelings and vice versa. So cognitive behavioral therapy and cognitive processing therapy helped quite a bit. And then writing that book, Warnings Unheeded, helped a lot. It was a form of immersion therapy where I was forced to confront all of the trauma in the book. Like every time I had to write out a chapter or a paragraph that had some traumatic event in it, in order to make it a good book, you have to write and rewrite and make it flow. And every time I wrote and rewrote, it had a lesser effect on me. And then also finding out the history behind the shooter. It just was helpful to understand why these things happen and hopefully how you can prevent future ones from occurring.
Was the book your idea, or did someone suggest it to you?
Well, I had been thinking about it, but may not have ever gotten around to it if not for Masad Ayub. He invited me out to a Lethal Force Institute class over at the Firearms Academy of Seattle. And he asked me to speak about the shooting, which I did. And then later on after that class, we were talking and he said I should write a book. And so I figured if Masad Ayub thought it was a good idea, that I might as well jump on that.
Yeah. Safe bet at that point.
Yeah.
So when you first struck out to write this book, did you already know you were going to discuss the aircraft accident as well, or is that something that like how did that become a thing? Because I would, even knowing it happened so quickly, so soon after the shooting, it wouldn't have occurred to me to research that and include that in the book. So what led you to cover that as well?
Well, if the listeners don't know, there was two tragedies that happened that week. On Monday was the active shooting at the hospital at Fairchild, and then that Friday, a B-52 was practicing for an air show, and was flown by a pilot that had a pretty low respect for safety, and was a hot dog pilot that did things with that B-52, which is an airliner sized
It's a big,
bomber.
big plane. Yeah.
It's like 180-foot wingspan. He would fly that large crew served aircraft like it was a single engine jet fighter, low on the ground and doing banking 90 degrees. And it was amazing what he did, but it was also incredibly unsafe. But he eventually pushed too far just a few days after the shooting and banked the plane 90 degrees while it was 200 feet off the ground, and it lost lift and plummeted into the ground right outside of our nuclear weapon storage area.
Oh boy.
Which is just demonstrates his disregard for safety. But in researching that shooting, or the B-52 crash, I realized that they had such similar causes, and that people had been warning about both of the incidents, the shooting and the plane crash. They both had been predicted. They both had been warned about, and both had been allowed to occur. So I figured they happened at the same base on the same week, and they have similar cause, that they probably deserve to be in the same book. A lot of people disagreed with me, and some still do, but I think it works together. I didn't know how I was going to incorporate both stories, but the way I did it was by alternating short stories about me and my upbringing and training, just really short chapters, interspersed with a chapter about the events that occurred before the shooting, and then following that with a chapter about the events that happened before the plane crash, and just alternating, telling three stories at once in alternating chapters.
I found that very engaging, for the record. I really enjoyed that aspect of it. If anyone's seen like a Pulp Fiction type movie where one minute you're here and the next minute you're there, I think it kept the book more engaging, because the next chapter I was going to go from where you were stationed overseas, and all of a sudden I'm in some, I'm now following the shooter in some other part of it or whatever. I thought it was really, really well done, and it kept the book, like I said, it kept me really engaged, knowing that I was about to hear more about this other person or that other person or this place or that event. So I thought it was really well done.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And the chapters, most of them are fairly short enough to where even if you don't like aircraft, it's short enough, and it's really interesting enough, even to the layman. It's written in a way that you don't have to know about aircraft and flight to appreciate the story. The stories, when I was researching them, they were just incredible. Every new statement or interview that I did just revealed more and more unbelievable information that I knew had to be in the book. And I think people will learn lessons from both of these tragedies, which hopefully will brings, if any good can come from it. People always say that, but I think that a lot of good can come from learning the lessons from these stories, lessons from our history.
100%. I couldn't agree more. That's the whole reason active self-protection exists, is to give people some free information on how to keep themselves and their families safe. And folks, if you listen to this podcast and think you've got the whole story, you just don't. There's so many more details, and it's such a great book. I really recommend you go pick up a copy. I assume it's available on Amazon for the like a paperback copy.
Wherever finer books are sold.
Yeah. Only finer books.
It's on.
That's my joke here. Only the finest podcast services have my podcast on them.
It's literally available everywhere in ebook, print, and audio. If you don't want to pay for it, it's available at your library. If it's not at your library, you can ask your librarian to order it or request it from another library in ebook, audio, and print. If you do want to contribute to my gun fund, you can buy it from Amazon or.
I got mine on Audible, the audiobook on Audible. I can't remember how much it was, but it wasn't anything crazy. And folks, if you're listening to this on your brand new MacBook or your new iPhone, you can afford it. This man did a lot of hard work. He deserves to get paid a little bit more. So go pick up a copy. I really recommend it. I wanted to ask you this as well. During the research, did you run into any Any walls, any roadblocks, any resistance from the Air Force about you, A, writing the book, or B, the research you're trying to do? Any resistance on that? I would imagine there might have been.
Yeah, you would think that they wouldn't be too happy with me telling the story, but no, they were pretty helpful and cooperative. A lot of the command staff out at Fairchild recently, they seem to legitimately want to learn from the past. And I did vet it. I didn't send them a copy of the book, but I went through public affairs and got permission to interview active duty members of the military who some of the witnesses are still in it or still were in active duty. Yeah, I jumped through all the hoops and they didn't try to stop me. So that's cool. They didn't learn all of their lessons. That shooting at Sutherland Springs Church was a prior Air Force. The perpetrator was prior Air Force, and the people at his previous base knew that he was a threat. They were afraid of him. They thought he was going to come on base and kill them, so they barred him from base. They made it so he wouldn't be legally allowed to come back on the base because they were afraid of him, but I don't think they passed that information on to anybody else outside of the Air Force, which is a problem.
Yeah, I had Stephen Williford on the show, and that never came up. So that's news to me right now, as a matter of fact. Yeah. I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was abusive and violent. People thought he was going to kill them. People at his workplace, his commanders, were worried that he was going to come back and shoot them, so they barred him from the base. And they were right. They just didn't know where it was going to happen.
Yeah, I think the bottom line here for anyone listening, especially if you're in an agency or a department or a military branch, is you've got to, as Stephanie Widener likes to say, if there's an incident happening, or there's an active shooter happening, or whatever, you need to rapidly and radically accept reality. Like, don't waste time wondering if you're in high school and there's loud bangs in the hallway. No, it's not fireworks. Let's not waste our time thinking or trying to wish it away. It's happening. But leading up to something like this, so many red flags. I mean, red flag is kind of a cliche, but it's true. There were so many things pointing to this happening, and I've been in a position with an organization where we had someone who was very, not to the extent of the shooter on the Air Force Base, but a lot of signs were like, man, this guy's not right. There's something going on, and we were concerned, and we got together and did something about it. So, I think the sooner you can nip the stuff in the bud, the better. Folks, please go out and get a copy of this book, either audio or paper, and get the rest of the lessons, because there's so much more to be learned from this incident and from his phenomenal research. Andy, was there anything else you wanted to talk about or cover before we parted ways here?
I'm sure I'll think of several after we disconnect, but I can't think of anything right now.
Well, let me ask you this: if you're talking to a police officer, a sheriff's deputy, military or otherwise, who is on their way to something like this, what do you want them to hear you saying in their head as they're on their way, getting ready to face down a potentially murderous active shooter? What's Andy Brown's advice for them?
Well, I wish I would have been able to talk to them prior to them responding to the incident, because they got a lot of preparation that could help them respond more effectively. But the biggest thing would be to get the hell in there, don't wait for backup, and seek out the threat and stop it.
Absolutely. My active shooter instructor broke it down by saying there's 2 rules in dealing with an active shooter: find him and kill him. And he just left it at that. I'm like, yeah, okay, class is over now? No, there was more to it than that. Andy Brown, the book is Warnings Unheeded, Twin Tragedies at Fairchild Air Force Base. I thank you so much for coming on the show, and we will talk to you soon. Take care, buddy.
Thank you.
All righty, gang. Welcome back to the Gutowski Files, featuring again this week. Sorry, Stephen, you've been demoted. Stephen Gutowski, who is the founder of TheReload.com, and also the host of the Weekly Reload podcast, which you can find at TheReload.com and on all of your major podcast outlets, and on YouTube. You can get some nice clips if you're on a quick break, you want to catch up on the news. There's short clips over there as well, or the whole show. I recommend either or both. Stephen, thanks so much for being here, buddy.
Yes, it's my pleasure as always.
So this week we are discussing again an article by Jake Fogelman, who's been busy apparently over there at the Reload. This article is back from
It's
October
prolific.
11th, but it is very relevant as the election is coming up. And the title of the article is "Everytown," which Everytown is a gun control organization, the largest one in the country. It pledges $7.2 million in October battleground state ad buys. So what does that mean? That means that they are doing a bunch of ads in key states that are still considered up in the air during this midterm election. Stephen, tell us what they're doing and why.
Yeah, so they're as you might expect spending quite a bit of money in a lot of the battleground states throughout the country, including places like Ohio, Georgia, Arizona. They're spending. They've already committed to spending $7.2 million this month on these ads that highlight. Most of them highlight gun control, as you might imagine, although some of them actually lead with the abortion debate, which is somewhat interesting, right? That they're not focused on their core issue, but are segmenting that, supplementing it with abortion messages as well.
Yeah, I think you'll agree with me, Stephen. I think most common sense people agree, left, right, and center. The campaign ads are generally kind of gross anymore. They're rarely just a candidate sitting there telling you what he or she plans on doing. Here in Arizona, we were discussing this earlier, a lot of ads from Democrat candidates where they're trying to portray themselves as more centrist than they probably actually are. That's a different matter, but I found it fascinating to hear people running for Senate who are Democrats claiming to want to do all this stuff. Like they're just sort of spewing Republican talking points about fighting the Democrats and building a border wall. So
yeah, you see that commonly on both sides with the candidates that are running in more swing areas.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll commonly see them run to the right or left in their primary and then go back to the middle in the general election. It's kind of like the standard operating procedure for most Senate candidates, in at least in elections where it's going to be relatively close.
Right.
But it is fairly unusual for an issue group to run ads that are explicitly about something other than their issue.
Right.
It's not unprecedented for sure, but it's usually something that you're not seeing often. I mean, the NRA doesn't really do it. At least it hasn't the last several elections. It may have done it in the past in some areas, but most of their ads are focused on gun policy. And Everytown, a lot of it's interesting too the way they're doing this, because what we initially reported on the Georgia ads where they highlighted abortion even before guns. They lead with abortion in these ads. But and this is not a new thing either. They were doing this in 2020 as well. In fact, in 2020, sometimes they wouldn't mention guns at all in their ads. They're actually talking about guns a little more often in this midterm election. But when we first reported on their Georgia ad and how it highlighted abortion before guns, they pointed us to research that they had done that showed combining the two issues was particularly motivating for some voters, and so that was why they're employing the strategy. But then now we have a number of ads from them that don't talk about abortion at all and are just about guns. So they're kind of all over the place when it comes to this strategy, and it seems like it's probably mostly dependent on where the ads are actually running. Like Pennsylvania, they're focused entirely on guns, and Arizona as well. But in Michigan and Georgia, they're combining that message with messaging on abortion.
Yeah, I'm looking at the article by Jake Fogelman here, and there's a quote that's so gross. These ads are so gross. And again, emphasize it's on both sides that they're kind of gross. This is a quote: "For too many women, home is the last place they feel safe. because when an abuser is armed, women are 5 times more likely to be killed. And then it goes on to say the candidate wants to make it easier for domestic abusers. What a disgusting thing to say, by the way, that as though any of these candidates actually want women to get hurt.
Yeah.
Is there any, this again might be out of your wheelhouse, forgive me if you don't know this, but is there any sort of liability for the people who put these ads out if they say something so egregious as to defame someone's character? Is that protected by the First Amendment? I don't know.
You could sue someone for libel or, based off of a political ad in theory, but the bar is extremely high for when you're talking about public figures like candidates for office, and for good reason, right? You don't want politicians to just be able to sue everybody who curses them out or whatever. But generally speaking, you have to show, that there was actual malice and that they intended to lie. Whereas like saying things like, in my opinion, or putting forth your opinion that Dr. Oz, who's that ad is about, is that the result of his policy positions is that it would make it easier for domestic abusers to get guns. That's a statement of opinion. It's not really something that they're not necessarily saying that he is a domestic abuser, or so. They're not making a direct claim of fact. They're just saying that we believe his policies will lead to, this terrible outcome, and that is, of course, a highly questionable conclusion to draw.
Right.
About not supporting universal background checks, but it's not necessarily libelous in the legal sense, right?
Just gross. I'll be happy when we get back to like ShamWow ads and shake and bake ads. Those are much more palatable. One more thing I want to tack on here. Whenever you hear a political ad, whenever they reference law enforcement, sort of the monolith of law enforcement supports this or opposes that. Caveat emptor, this is a thing where when they say law enforcement wants this or that thing, that could mean anything from a particular management official, so like a sheriff or the head of an agency. It could mean the union for that agency. It could mean any number of things. So whenever you see someone say, because it says in one of the ads, Carrie Lake, who's running in Arizona, sided against law enforcement and opposing red flag laws. Look, all the law enforcement officers that I know are very pro Second Amendment, are very pro, every citizen who's able to be able to have a firearm in their home or carry it. So careful when you hear that law enforcement monolith thing, because it's frequently not true about most rank and file. LEOs are very pro Second Amendment. Just as an aside.
Yeah, I mean, there's a breakdown in law enforcement like there is in most areas of life where or within most groups, where you often have police chiefs who tend to be appointed by city officials, and they tend to break down, along the more liberal, or at least more open to the idea of gun control, or more supportive of stricter gun laws. And then you often have, sheriff's associations, which are, of course, sheriffs are elected by people, and they're usually in more rural areas, although obviously a lot of cities will have sheriff's departments as well. But there tends to be a pretty big political breakdown between those two groups inside of law enforcement, and especially on how they view guns, because your sheriffs will view guns more positively than a lot of your big city police chiefs do.
Right.
And so, that's how a lot of these political ads work. There were law enforcement officials who were supportive of red flag laws, or supportive of, or opposed to, constitutional carry, or any number of things. You can find law enforcement groups that hold that position. It doesn't mean that all law enforcement feels that way. And obviously a lot of political ads will blur that line one way or the other, and try to paint their position as the popular one, and or really since most political ads now are attack ads, like all the ones we're citing in this article. All these Evertown ads are attack ads. They they will paint their opponents as wildly out of touch with, what the popular position is, which is, of course, whatever they believe in, whatever the group running the ad believes in.
Yeah. So bottom line, political ads are gross, and I wish they'd stop. Stephen, I want to thank you for being here, folks. Go check him out over at thereload.com. Again, all your major podcast outlets, you can listen to the podcast. You can watch it on YouTube or segments on YouTube. I highly recommend all of it. Stephen relies on your membership to fund his important work, to bring us these stories, to point out the stuff that a lot of other media sources aren't covering. He is unique in the space. So please, if you're lamenting the lack of down the middle, sane, sober reporting on firearm stuff, go give him a look. Consider getting a membership. Stephen, thank you so much. We'll see you next week.
Absolutely.